dancing. The river of God fills our hearts with cheer. The river of God fills our mouths with laughter, and we rejoice for the river is here. The river of God, ere it teems with life, and all who touch it can be revived. And all who linger on this river shore will come back a-thirsting for more of the Lord. The river of God sets our feet to dancing. The river of God fills our hearts with cheer. The river of God fills our mouths with laughter, and we rejoice for the river is here. Up to the mountain we love to go, to find the presence of the Lord. Along the banks of the river we run, with dancing and laughter, giving praise to the Son. The river of God sets our feet to dancing. The river of God fills our hearts with cheer. The river of God fills our mouths with laughter, and we rejoice for the river is here. The river of God sets our feet to dancing. The river of God fills our hearts with cheer. The river of God fills our mouths with laughter, and we rejoice for the river is here. And we rejoice for the river is here. And we rejoice for the river is here. There's a fountain free, 'tis for you and me. Let us haste, oh haste to its spring. 'Tis the fount of love from the source above, and he bids us all freely drink. Will you come? Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me. Thirsty soul, hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. There's a living stream with a crystal gleam. From the throne of life now it flows. While the waters roll, let the weary soul hear the call that forth freely goes. Will you come? Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me. Thirsty soul, hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. 'Tis a fountain open for all.
Great things he hath taught us, great things he hath done, and great our rejoicing through Jesus the Son. But purer and higher and greater will be our wonder, our transport when Jesus we see. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, let the earth hear his voice. Praise the Lord, let the people rejoice. Oh, come to the Father through Jesus the Son, and give him the glory, great things he hath done.
Hello, and welcome to our study in Acts. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in Acts chapter 25. Our class is proceeding pretty rapidly with the format that we're following, and we don't have a lot of discussion to go through with yet, so as I have more points of discussion, I will prepare material for that and post it so that we have some follow-through with what I'd committed to do before. But as it is, we'll continue as we are now. On the road to Emmaus, two men found themselves in the presence of a stranger, and as that stranger discussed the word with them along the way, They found that there was a burning in their hearts. They didn't realize it until he left their presence shortly thereafter, that burning sensation was gone and that he had been the reason it was there. They realized that this was Jesus in their very midst, and it's that burning sensation that we hope to kindle in your hearts as we open the Word together and look at what God has for us there. We have found that that burning sensation can be in our own hearts as we draw near to the Lord through His Word. So open your Bibles with us now as we enter into this study, and God bless. Acts chapter 25 from the NIV. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Verse 4. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. Verse 6. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Verse 8. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Verse 10. Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Verse 12. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, You have appealed to Caesar you will go. Verse 13. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, There's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. Verse 18. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus whom Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Verse 22. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. He replied, Tomorrow you will hear him. Verse 23. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I have found that he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it's unreasonable to send a prisoner to Rome, without specifying the charges against him. Last time we were in Acts chapter 24, and we saw in Acts chapter 24 that the regional governor, Felix, had called upon the high priest and the Sanhedrin to come and speak their case against Paul in his court. They came and they had representation by Tertullus, which was noted there, and he said some very nice things about the governor. And Paul brought his defense, and in his defense, he made it clear that he was not guilty of the things that they were charging him with, according to their understanding, and that the only thing that they could really claim that he had done, that he would admit to doing, was claiming that the resurrection was significant, and thereby inducing the arguments that resulted between their factions as a result. Felix held him over and rationalized that he would hear more from Lysias, the Roman commander who had arrested Paul, when he showed up. But in fact, he did not, or at least there's no recording here that ever occurred. But instead, he heard Paul from day to day with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and was seemingly at least impressed with Paul and what he had to say. But apparently his real rationalization for holding Paul for such a long period was that he hoped that Paul would offer him a bribe to be released. Well, this went on for 2 years, so there you go. There's something to be said for patience just in that. And after that time, Felix went on to something else. It's not stated here what he went on to. And Porcius Festus took over at the end of chapter 24. And Felix had left Paul in prison, basically, as a favor to the Jews, it's stated. So we go on into chapter 25. And at the beginning of chapter 25, Festus has taken over and went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem and has a discussion there with the high priests and the chief men. And they, in the course of that discussion, bring their charges against Paul again, rationalizing that they could ask the governor, the regional governor, I'm not sure what his official title was, I'm going to call him regional governor, that he would have, they rationalized that he would call Paul up from Caesarea to Jerusalem to be tried there in their presence. This they had hoped to do because they were going to lay in wait and ambush the group that was bringing Paul up and kill Paul there. So this is 2 years later, and they're still hot to kill Paul. And it's not said here what happened to the men who vowed not to eat or drink until they killed Paul. But if they laid true to their vow, then they must be dead. And I doubt that's the case. So here we have them, this group of Jewish leaders making this plan. But Festus wouldn't really have any of it. Festus had his own idea of the hierarchy here, and he didn't consider himself to be subject to their desires. His rationalization was, I'm going back to Caesarea where Paul is, so why would I bring him here? And he said as much to them, and he said, you who have authority and wish to bring these charges should present yourself in Caesarea. And he remained there a little bit longer and went down to Caesarea, it says 10 days later. And it says the very next day he was sitting on the judgment seat and commanded these Jewish people to come in who had proceeded to come from Jerusalem and into Caesarea. And they brought their charges, which apparently bewildered Festus. And we'll see that a little bit, but in a little bit. But Paul does make a defense. It says in verse 8, while he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. And then in verse 9, it says, Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem? So he was willing to make this compromise to appease the Jewish leaders if Paul was willing to do it as well. I don't know if Paul sensed that this was a trap, or if Paul truly believed that he had done what he was expected to do as a Roman before the courts, and he had had enough of both Felix and Festus delaying any further. But whatever his motivation, he claimed his right as a Roman citizen to be heard by Caesar. And Festus conferred with the council, and I don't know again what was in his heart, but he didn't challenge Paul on this point. He said to Caesar, "You have appealed, and you will go to Caesar." And that was probably the wisest thing he could do at that point, because he couldn't even release him once Paul had requested to be heard by Caesar. So it says, after a number of days, King Agrippa, this is not the King Agrippa we've heard before, but his son or grandson, I forget now which, who has ascended to the throne in place of the King Agrippa previously mentioned. And he presents himself to Festus there, and after some more time, it says that there were days that went by, Festus brings out the case of Paul and says that he doesn't have anything to bring before Caesar to claim any significant charges to justify what he's going to do. And he explains that he didn't understand the argument, and this is again out of the New King James Version. I'm doing the discussion point here, that he was disappointed to hear the accusations the Jewish leaders had brought against him, because they didn't make sense to him, and he didn't have anything to bring, and so he was asking Agrippa to listen to him also, in order to have his opinions about what he might present to Caesar when he transferred Paul to Caesar. Agrippa was apparently aware of the scenario to the point where he was interested enough to hear the case. He said that he would like to hear him, and Festus made arrangements to do it the very next day. And it says that on the next day, Agrippa and his wife came with great pomp into the auditorium with prominent men and commanders of the military. And Paul was there and came in with and Festus said that he wanted them to hear the case, because these Jewish people had claimed that he was not fit to live any longer. So he kind of does a brief review of the situation before Agrippa, but he had again reasserted that he didn't hear anything worthy of death. And he makes this case again, that it seems something that King Agrippa could give counsel on to present before Caesar. And that's pretty much the end of it. We don't go into the next part that we find in chapter 26, where Paul actually speaks. It's just this presentation. So we have this whole chapter here given on the machinations between the Romans and the Jewish leadership, both religious and non-religious leadership. And it's interesting to me that there is such a striking difference between the religious leaders and the King Agrippa, who was apparently willing to hear. And we'll talk more about that next time. But Paul again makes use of his privilege as a Roman citizen, and this brings into light the question of how we might do similarly with our rights as American citizens, or wherever you are in whatever states you might find yourself in. If you have privilege, how do you use it appropriately in service of the Lord's will? And there was much made in the commentary about the nature of action over inaction when we serve the Lord. How is it that we are called on to wait upon the Lord and also to act on behalf of the Lord? How do we reconcile those two things? And I think we see a really good example here in these two chapters, 24 and 25, of the patience that Paul exhibited in waiting on the Lord to act. He waited 2 years under Felix, doing whatever Felix asked him to do. And he used his privilege under Festus very quickly. He didn't really beat around the bush with Festus. He took that opportunity when it presented itself, which was almost immediately after Festus took over, to appeal his case to Caesar, which sent him to Rome. I mean, that's the reason he went to Rome. Why he didn't do that under Felix, it's not clear. Felix had done similar things as governor. He had Paul in his custody for a very long time, having Paul present his case to him on a regular basis, it seems. But he never made this appeal, or if he made the appeal, it's not recorded. And there is something to say for that. It could have been done many, many times, but Felix may have never felt compelled to actually send Paul to Rome. Whereas Festus seems to have felt it was required as under his responsibilities as governor to send a Roman upon request to be heard by Caesar. Now, there's not really a lot else to say in this chapter as far as I can discern, but again, I'm open to any commentary, and if you have anything to say, I hope you'll share it. I again want to express my thanks to everybody and their patience through this period in this format, trying to find a way to bring the word to you in a meaningful way from Scripture, and also the work that Gary and Scott have been doing in preparing the materials and getting them streamed out at appropriate times and appropriate ways. I do appreciate that work. They've spent countless hours doing that work, and there's been some construction work going on. I think we saw the camera work showing the auditorium in its current state is very disheveled. It's not in very good order. But when it's all done and ready, hopefully in the next week, we will be able to assemble there and enjoy new features and new directions as far as how we're going to present the streaming at that point. So I look forward to that. I hope you do too, and I hope that you have a good week. God bless.